going to talk a little bit about the anthology and the motivations behind that, and in amongst that I'll be introducing Valeria and Uljana's work. Then we'll hear readings from them before going into a sort of discussion about the book's concerns. So I find it difficult to get excited about anything in art or writing unless it effectively constitutes some form of attack on the status quo. And when I segued into studying and researching translation after years of looking at literature, I sort of realised that I found the most antagonistic, critical and compositional mode that I'd encountered up until then. So the book basically constitutes the last 4 years of my research into contemporary poetry translation. And the aim of the book is to, I guess, broaden and elucidate ideas around translation for all kinds of readers. So those familiar with translation theory and those to whom it's an entirely new idea. And what I really wanted to emphasize were the political dimensions of translation, and translation also as a subjective process, one that reflects political movements. And here in my notes I've got Reed, Basner and Lefebvre quote, which is what Harry did in his introduction to me, so you've already heard that. But effectively, it's this idea of translation as a manipulative act that I want to put forward, both on a sort of macro and micro level. So at the level of selection, obviously the translator has to find something to translate, and then that is brought to editors and publishers, and so what reaches us in translation has already been through sort of several processes. And then on the micro level, of course, there's how the translator chooses to translate any given text, what decisions go into how they bring that into English. And I think this is important because thinking about translation causes us to think about foreign literature in translation and how it's represented and how it's rendered for us, English language readers. And the anthology also, I guess, constitutes a broader redress to UK literary culture and sort of anthology format. So instead of one-off translations of individual poems, which is what I'm used to seeing, this book contains 29 extended excerpts from translation projects. So it's this idea of presenting the translations as processes rather than products. Also, instead of presenting translations from a small handful of Western European countries, we've tried to be a bit broader than that. So we've got source texts for the translations from Korean, Vietnamese, Pashtun, Greek, Slovenian, Japanese, and also some endangered languages, so Catalan and Galician. Male writers and translators represent about a third of the book's contributors, so again that's a sort of conversion of the ratio that we're used to seeing. And each translation begins with a note that I've written which foregrounds the translator and her process. Because I think really key for me in generating thoughts about translation and in sort of thinking ahead to translation's future health, literary translation's future health, is rendering the translator visible and sort of challenging this pervasive idea of the translator as a sort of neutral person, or just a sort of siphon through which the foreign text passes and appears in English. The source texts are also included, and rather than being at the back of the book or sort of altogether excluded, they've been placed at the very centre of the book in a different paper stock so that they're highly visible. Uljana Wolf, who we'll be hearing from shortly, is one of the anthology's contributors, and she is a German poet and translator, though her work is inherently multilingual, which I understand as an attempt to disrupt monolingual spaces and to destabilise essentialist notions of language altogether. The work that's included in the book is an English language translation by the poet Sophie Collins. And Sophie's translation of Uljana's text is excerpted from a chapbook called I Mean I Dislike That Fate That I Was Made to Wear. And I think Sophie's translation can be more accurately deemed a response to Uljana's work, in the sense that just as Uljana's work is multilingual and self-reflexive and self-examining of its language, and always and often sort of turning in and outwards and back on itself, so too is Sophie's translation of it. In her Translators Afterwards, Sophie writes that her translations do not attempt a pure or perfect congruence, and this is because they take their cue from the source text, from Uljana's work, whose central concern is languages and borders and the sites of friction, ambiguity, and plain confusion that are established in those places. She's also looking at the reductive effect of borders and other constructs on our identity and the terms pertaining to those identities. So today I think we'll be hearing a bit from the work included in the book, but also from a new collaboration between Sophie and Uljana. Valeria's work is not included in the book, but I've been fascinated with it ever since a friend who works at Granta Books in the UK sent me a copy of Sidewalks. Valeria's past books have been written in Spanish, and her work is translated into English by Christina McSweeney. Actually, I meant to ask you, is the new book it's written directly into English, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's interesting, given the content. The new book is called Tell Me How It Ends, and that just came out a few days ago, didn't it? But I think it was, you started writing it in 2014, and from what I understand, it was prompted by the upsurge in child refugees into the US at that time. So Valeria started working as an interpreter at an immigration court here in New York City, where she helped children complete the immigration questionnaire, getting answers from them in Spanish and then translating these into English for the purposes of the form. And this is a quote from war correspondent John Lee Anderson's short introduction to the book. He says, depending on those answers, the children might or might not be granted legal sanctuary of some sort, and thus a future in the United States. Luiselli soon realized it was impossible to fit the children's lives neatly into the boxes provided, observing, the children's stories are always shuffled, stuttered, always shattered beyond the repair of narrative order. The problem with trying to tell their story is that it has no beginning, no middle, and no end. And this is, I guess, going off on a tangent somewhat, but it put me in mind of the words of an incredible UK-based poet called Vani Capildeo, who I've been listening to in a recent podcast and who actually also has some work in the book. She was discussing rape testimonies and how traumatic events upend any notion of a sort of shared reality or of segmented chronological progression. And that, you know, paradoxically is the basis on which those stories are often discredited. So that seemed like an interesting connection. And then also what occurred to me while looking at the book today was the emotional labour and fatigue of interpreting. I'd recently been to I'd recently watched a panel discussion with female interpreters who work in the context of gender-based violence. And they were sort of talking about the emotional toll of every day, working 9 to 5, and interpreting the testimonies of victims in the first person. Because when you're an interpreter, you're repeating in the first person rather than referring to, the person who's speaking in the third person. So they're saying, I was hit in the face by my partner, I was raped by my husband or my friend or whatever. And there's also this sense that those statements repeated again and again, they sort of simultaneously gain and lose in significance. And that seems an interesting facet of the book to me. So I actually cite Valeria in my introduction to the book, and I'll read that now. At this point, I'm sort of framing translation as resistance, as an attack on an aggressively Anglophone culture, which is what we're operating in. And Valeria here is talking about sort of the channels of translation. So she says, I think of the generation of poets in Mexico who started translating from English into Spanish. They started translating Joyce and T.S. Eliot and Langston Hughes and William Carlos Williams for the first time in the 1920s. They created journals of translation that were thought of as spaces in which to publish their generation from other tongues into Spanish. They were interested in translation and translation as a way of allowing another language and another tradition to influence their work, the work within their nation. Their contemporaries, however, T.S. Eliot, Pound, etc., never really translated their Latin American counterparts. So, as Valeria suggests there, literary translation has always been an inequitable exchange. Translated literature constitutes just a tiny percentage of all books published in English. The famous figure that everyone cites is 3%. I'm not exactly sure how accurate that is. Some people say it's probably a bit higher, others a bit lower, but what we do know is that in other literary cultures, work translated from English into those languages is much, much higher, definitely above 20%, but even more than that, sometimes 40%. Before we hear Valeria and Uljana read, and we'll hear them in that order, I thought I'd just read a text, a translation from someone in the book who can be here. And it's Don Lee Choi's translation of a Korean poet, Kim Hae-soon. And these translations are incredible, but I also love what Don Lee Choi says about translation in interviews and, well, anytime she's asked, really. She has a really sort of caustic and aggressive voice when it comes to translation. So she says, I won't go into detail about why this word and not that word, because details are suffocating to me. My translation intent has nothing to do with personal growth, intellectual exercise, or cultural exchange, which implies an equal standing of some sort. South Korea and the US are not equal. I am not transnationally equal. My intent is to expose what a neo-colony is, what it does to its own, what it eats and shits. Kim Hae-soon's poetry reveals all this, and this is why I translate her work. And I'll just read the first poem in the selection, which is called Pig Speaks. Anyway, to nail a pig on a cross would be too natural, meaningless. I enter the Zen room, sit cross-legged, and stare at the wall in order to meditate. You know, I'm confessing right now. I'm actually pig. You know, I've been pig since birth. Filthy. I'm filthy, really filthy. A mind? I have no such thing. I'm smart nevertheless. My IQ is the highest among mammals. I love cleanliness. I hate dreams of overflowing toilets. My IQ drops 30 points after having such a dream. I snort like someone who has woken up from a morning nap submerged in filthy water. I want to blow my nose, but there's no tissue in the Zen room. Don't the monks ever have a runny nose? You know, you pig are also melancholic. The fact that pig also has an expression. Your body fattened by mushy sorrow, filthy water, slippery, slippery muck. At Kunsthal in Rotterdam, I saw Jan Benning's photographs of Sumatran grandmothers during Japanese colonial rule, but there were only two kinds of expression in the photos. Anxiety or sorrow. So as I walked, I attached names to the wrinkled faces. You are anxiety, you are sorrow, sorrow then anxiety, anxiety, sorrow, sorrow. My content, anxiety and sorrow made from a lifetime of grunting and pigging out. Sorrow and anxiety, your call along the barley field's narrow path. Pig passes by. But pig is told to drag out a pig from the inside of its heart and clean up its pigsty. A monk passes by carrying a bamboo stick after hitting pig who fell asleep while meditating. Anyway, to nail pig on a cross would be too natural, meaningless. Anyway, if pig dies and resurrects as pig, what pig would believe it? Anyway, I shouldn't have come here. A temple stay doesn't suit me at all. You know, I'm going to confess in a bit, but I'm pig. I was originally pig. Okay, so please welcome Valeria Luiselli. briefly about interpretation as very often traumatic work. The kind of interpretation that I do is not simultaneous, which is exactly how you say it is, although sometimes I do note down in first person, but it's very different to simultaneous interpretation. I don't know if any of you have seen footage from the Nuremberg trials, for example. If you haven't, I recommend that you do, in which simultaneous translators, most of them women, by the way, would have a button under the desk behind which they sat, interpreting and simultaneously interpreting the testimonies of people who gave orders to kill others. And it would at some point become so unbearable that they could push this button and there would be a pause. People could go outside, breathe, recompose a little bit, and then go back. But well, those videos are some very, very brutal, sinister, but also very valuable testimonies of how also interpretation became a fundamental post World War communicating among countries. So this book, Tell Me How It Ends, is an essay that I began writing in 2014. Well, no, I began taking notes in 2014, right after the so-called American immigration crisis, although it has been called Central American refugee crisis. It has had several names. And I first heard about the so-called crisis when most people did. Lawyers knew about it long before the rest of us did. It had migration to children arriving alone at the American southern border was a phenomenon that had been going on for years. But in the summer of 2014, it exploded in the media because between October 2013 and that summer of 2014, there had been a huge surge of children arriving. Suddenly, in just that period, there had been 80,000 children arriving alone at the border. Imagine the number there. And after that, between that summer of 2014 and April of the next year, 2015, there were 120 kids, plus minus, detained at the border. Now, these kids are fleeing from violence in the Northern Triangle, that is Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. The violence that they flee from is mostly gang violence, Mara Salvatrucha gang, MS-13, and Barrio 18. I'll be kind of schematic here, of course it's much more complicated than this, but they're fleeing those gangs which were in turn born and bred in LA in the 1970s and 80s. They were born and bred in LA from Salvadoran communities, Honduran communities that had fled a civil war in El Salvador. The civil war in El Salvador, again, it's very schematically, began when the military government went into power and began massacring either left-wing groups or civilians, just because. So one-fifth of the country eventually had to flee and find refuge in other countries. And well, guess who paid for the militarization of that government? The Reagan administration. So when the disaster exploded and people started seeking refuge outside the U.S., said, okay, we'll take some of you. And they took this Salvadoran community in. And then among that community, these two gangs sprouted within the context of LA gang culture. I won't go into that anymore, but that's kind of the backstory. What's happening today is that those kids, well, let me tell you one more thing. Those gangs members, some of them were eventually deported
And what happened through deportation, well, a lot of people were deported, not only the gang members, people, Salvatorans and Central Americans were deported. And what happened was that instead of eradicating a problem, the problem spread like a metastasis, like a cancer. And those gangs that were circumscribed became transnational armies almost, now covering huge portions of the hemisphere, the United States, Mexico. In Mexico, they've joined some of the drug cartels, and then of course back to Central America. So the kids that now flee El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, flee those gangs, and a lot of them end up in small towns in the US where there are more malas, MS-13s. So it's like a cyclical nightmare that these kids just cannot escape. I work I teach in a university in Long Island, in a town called Hempstead, which was the town where it was very famous for very visible confrontations between the Bloods and Crips, for example. Now that town is full of malas and MS-13s, and the kids that arrive are back there. So I'm going to read just a little bit because I've given an introduction that's far too long. The last thing I'll say is I wrote this shorter version of this originally in English for a journal here, a journal called Freeman's. Then I was asked by my editors in Mexico to rewrite it in Spanish, and I agreed hesitantly because rewriting, self-translating oneself is not an easy thing. I mean, basically, I didn't really agree. They gave me 5 tequilas, one after the other, and made me sign a napkin, in which I agreed to rewriting this, but also like all the rest of the books that I dare write in English, not in Spanish. And Mexicans are very naturalist in that respect. I know this. So I did, and I'm actually really happy that I did, because when I wrote in Spanish, I had to open up another Pandora's box, which was the Mexican chapter of these kids and their journey. And the Mexican chapter is really hell. What happens to them in America is really cupcakes compared to what happens to them in Mexico. And so while writing in Spanish, I simply had to fight with another set of monsters, not the border patrol, but the Mexican migra. And so it was doubled in length. And then I retranslated, but with help, with major help. And the first versions, in fact, were done by a young editor-translator in my publisher, Lizzie Davis. She very carefully highlighted everything that I had added and then rendered it into the first English version, and then I worked on top of that. So this is the result of that back and forth. Okay, I'll read a little bit from the beginning, and then maybe a little bit from one of the interviews with kids. Why did you come to the United States? That's the first question on the intake questionnaire for unaccompanied child migrants. The questionnaire is used in the Federal Immigration Court in New York, where I started working as a volunteer interpreter in 2015. My task there is a simple one. I interview children following the intake questionnaire, and then translate their stories from Spanish into English. But nothing is ever that simple. I hear words spoken in the mouths of children, threaded in complex narratives. They are delivered with hesitance, sometimes distrust, always with fear. I have to transform them into written words, succinct sentences, and barren terms. The children's stories are always shuffled, stuttered, always shattered beyond the repair of narrative order. The problem with trying to tell their story is that it has no beginning, no middle, and no end. When the intake interview with a child is over, I meet with lawyers to deliver and explain my transcription and occasional notes. The lawyers then analyze the child's responses, trying to come up with options for a viable defense against a child's deportation and the potential relief he or she is likely to get. The next step is to find legal representation. Once an attorney has agreed to take on a case, the real legal battle begins. If the battle is won, the children will obtain some form of immigration relief, and if it's lost, they will receive a deportation order from the judge. I watch our own children sleep in the back seat of the car as we cross the George Washington Bridge into New Jersey. I glance back at them now and then from the co-pilot seat. My 10-year-old stepson visiting us from Mexico and my 5-year-old daughter. Behind the wheel, my husband concentrates on the road ahead. It is the summer of 2014. We are waiting for our green cards to either be granted or denied. And in the meantime, we decide to go on a family road trip. We will drive from Harlem, New York, to the town of Cochise, Arizona, near the US-Mexico border. According to the slightly offensive parlance of US immigration law, for the 3 years or so that we had lived in New York, we had been non-resident aliens. That's the term used to describe anyone from outside the US alien, whether or not they're residents. There are non-resident aliens, resident aliens, and even removable aliens that I know of. We wanted to become resident aliens, even though we knew what applying for green cards implied. The lawyers, the expenses, the many vaccinations and medical exams, the months of sustained uncertainty, the rather humiliating intermediate steps such as having to wait for an advance parole document in order to be able to leave the country and be paroled back in like a criminal, as well as the legal prohibition against traveling abroad without losing immigration status before being granted advance parole. Despite all that, we decided to apply. The green card application is nothing like the intake questionnaire for unaccompanied minors. When you apply for a green card, you have to answer things like, do you intend to practice polygamy? And are you a member of the Communist Party? And have you ever knowingly committed a crime of moral turpitude? And although nothing can or should be taken lightly when you're in the fragile situation of asking for permission to live in a country that's not your own, there is something almost innocent in the green card application's preoccupations with and visions of the future and its possible threats: polyamorous debauchery, communism, weak morals. The green card questionnaire has a retro kind of candor, like the grainy Cold War film we watched on VHS. The intake questionnaire for undocumented children, on the other hand, reveals a colder, more cynical and brutal reality. It reads as if it were written in high definition, and as you make your way down its 40 questions, it's impossible not to feel that the world has become a much more fucked up place than anyone could have ever imagined. I'm just skipping over to a couple of fragments. So we were driving at this point in the book. We were driving now deeper into the southern United States, Southwest. We decided not to tell anyone in diners and gas stations that we're Mexican, just in case. But we were stopped a few times by Border Patrol officials and have to show our passports and display big smiles when we explain we're just riders and just on vacation. We have to confirm that yes, we are only riders, even if yes, we are also Mexican. Why are we there and what are we riding? They always want to know. We are riding a Western, sir. That's what we tell them, that we're riding a Western. We also tell them that we came to Arizona for the open skies and the silence and the emptiness. The second part more true than the part about riding Western, which is untrue. Handing back our passports, one official says sardonically, "So you come all the way down here for the inspiration?" We know better than to contradict anyone who carries a badge and a gun, so we just say, "Yes, sir." Because how do you explain that it's never inspiration that drives you to tell a story, but rather a combination of anger and clarity. How do you say, no, we don't find inspiration here, but we find a country that is as beautiful as it is broken, and we are also somehow broken with it, and feel ashamed, confused, and sometimes hopeless, and are trying to figure out how to do something about all that. And I'll read you a very last fragment that reflects an actual interview in court, deeper into the book, which follows the structure of the 40 questions that screeners and interviewers ask the children in court in order to get a first panorama of what their situation is, and then try to seek a lawyer that will get them, hopefully pro bono, immigration relief. Often my daughter asks me, so how does the story of those children end? I don't know how it ends, I tell her. My daughter often follows up on the stories she half hears. There's one story that obsesses her, a story I only tell her in pieces and for which I have not been able to offer a real ending. It begins with two girls in the courtroom. They're 5 and 7 years old, from a small village in Guatemala. Spanish is their second language, but the older girl speaks it well. We sit around a mahogany table in the room where the interviews take place, and their mother observes from one of the benches in the back. The little girl concentrates on her coloring book, the crayon in her right hand. The older one has her hands crossed as an adult might, and she answers my questions one by one. She's a little shy, but tries to be clear and precise in her answers, delivering all of them with a big smile, toothless here and there. Why did you come to the United States? I don't know. How did you travel here? A man brought us. A coyote? No, a man. Was he nice to you? Yes, he was nice, I think. And where did you cross the border? I don't know. Texas? Arizona? Yes, Texas, Arizona. It's impossible to go on with the interview, so I asked the lawyers to make an exception and allow the mother to meet with us, at least for a while. Usually in court, the parents or older family members that sponsor the kids, meaning that act as custodians of the kids here, even if they're not their parents, are not allowed to be in a screening because their presence can modify the kids' answers. So they're usually not allowed to be in screenings, but when the kids are really small, there's just no other way. And sometimes there are kids in court as young as 2 years old. So of course, in that situation, there's always parents or family. I realized it's impossible to go on with an interview, so I asked the lawyers to make an exception and allow the mother to meet with us, at least for a while. We go back to question 1, and the mother responds for the girls, filling halls, explaining things, and also telling her own version of the story. When the younger of her daughters turned 2, she decided to migrate north and left them in the care of their grandmother. She crossed 2 national borders with no documents. She wasn't detained by border patrol and managed to cross the desert with a group of people. After a few weeks, she arrived in Long Island, where she had a cousin. That's where she settled. Years passed, and the girls grew up. Years passed, and she remarried. She had another child. One day, she called her mother, the grandmother of the girls, and told her that the time had come. She had saved enough money to bring the girls over. I don't know how the grandmother responded to the news of her granddaughter's imminent departure, but she noted the instructions down carefully and later explained them to the 2 girls. In a few days, a man was going to come for them, a man who would help them get back to their mother. She told them that it would be a long trip, but that he would keep them safe. The man had taken many other girls from their village safely across the 2 borders to their mothers, and everything had gone well. So everything would go well this time too. The day before they left, their grandmother sewed a 10-digit telephone number on the collar of their dress. A dress each girl would wear throughout the entire trip. It was a 10-digit number the girls had not been able to memorize, as hard as she tried to get them to. So she had decided to embroider it on their dresses and repeat, over and over, a single instruction. They should never take this dress off, not even to sleep, And as soon as they reached America, as soon as they met the first American policeman, they were to show the insider's address's collar to him. He would then dial the number and let them speak to their mother. The rest would follow. The rest did follow. They made it to the border, were kept in custody in the Dieleda or icebox for an indefinite time period. The girls said they didn't remember how many days, but said that they were colder in there than they had ever been before. After that, they went to a shelter, and a few weeks later, they were put on a plane and flown to JFK, where their mother, baby brother, and stepfather were waiting for them. That's it, my daughter asks. That's it, I tell her. That's how it ends? Yes, that's how it ends. But of course it doesn't end there. That's just where it begins, with a court summons, the first notice to appear. Okay, I'll stop there. I guess I should explain just quickly that there's cases in court that are very frustrating because if kids don't tell you that they are fleeing from specific circumstances such as persecution and great levels of violence and neglect, they are actually then not eligible for asylum or visas similar to asylum. So in the case of these girls, the frustration was that they didn't have the language to tell their story, and who knows what the story was. But if the story was, for example, that they were just fleeing from Guatemala to join their mother and grow up with their mother, which is something that a child has a right to do, that's just not enough. That's not enough for asylum. So well, that's the thing with the court, the cases in court is that when you're translating, you are just political. You can't really modify the answers or even push the kids' answers to a specific end, right? So it's a kind of very frustrating in between that you can't do anything and you can't make sure that their answers are good enough for asylum. Okay, I'll leave it there now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uljana Wolf. Thank you, Valeria. That was very strong, beautiful, and so important what you do right now. Thank you, Sophie, for inviting me and for including this work in the mythology. And of course, the work of the translator. Sophie, was she? No. Sophie, the other Sophie, she was coming from England, also arriving today. I guess she's so I want to read the piece that's in the anthology, which kind of relates, I think connects in some ways to many of the things that we have talked about here. The piece is called Analog on Oranges, and analog is written with two N's, refers to the name of Anna O, a very famous case from Freud and Roy's studies on hysteria, the first case, as it were. And just quickly a background of Anna O's, her name is Berta Pappenheim, a Jewish girl born in 1981 to a very Orthodox household, who went to school for a little while, but then I think when she was around 14, she was taken out of school to be prepared for her life as an Orthodox wife. Woman, but she studied and she wrote books, and around the time that her father died when she was 21, she suddenly became hysterical. She had a lot of pain, unexplicable pain, and had to be treated, not by Freud but by Breuer, but they were working at that time on still hypnosis as a cure, or as a therapy really. And they developed, Boy and her developed something called the talking cure. So when if there was a symptom, and she already had a lot of symptoms, he would try to engage her and find a way to the root of the symptom by talking and freely associating. So she was credited with being sort of the inventor of psychoanalysis. It all didn't really work, and she moved to Frankfurt after a while, and then her life really started because she had a more liberated Jewish sort of Bürgertum, where she then started her work as a social worker and became someone who really worked on and helped and translated and traveled a lot, helping girls who were trafficked from the Ukraine mostly, and sex trafficking, and did a lot of social work and founded a house for fallen girls. So this is Anna, this is a little bit of background. One of the symptoms that she had was language confusion. She started to speak suddenly in tongues, and then for a while she also completely could not speak German anymore, but only English for 9 months. And no one understood her, and they had to get a guard, a warden who spoke only English, and very strange. So in my book, which sort of deals with translation, but also the failure of translation and multilinguality, and sort of questioning the idea of what a mother tongue is and what this kind of belonging is and how it ties us to a nation, a state, maybe a system, a medical system, a patriarchy, and all these things. Anna always sort of the central figure. And there's two analogs, analog on oranges, analog on flowers, that are tied to her symptoms. And this symptom, as many people figure out quickly, is that she only ate oranges for a while, refused to eat or drink anything else. I, a native, something or other girl, solide geistige Nahrung, she digested mit affektiver Athletik und Orangenpolitik. When it's time for oranges, es ist keine Zeit, no time at all für nichts. I only eat oranges, at least they exist, if not much else is no things at all, not much. Petite little boats and string-thin skin, I suck on them for hours, keeps me busy, free run for the tongue, looking for thread between teeth, interlaced space, and rooms to own, not much. Oranges or existence all around, oranges or residence all around, with weighty curtains and rooms that step together, conspiring, brother, mother, doctor, and the wardress, daily session, that's how they planned it all, wall to wall, around my standstill arms. But oranges exist as transportation, orange buses, orange trains over cobble headstone pavement rattling through the ages. And on my bed, those glimmering signals, the peel, orange swinging segments, white-skinned bridges, I lay them out for hours, keeps me going drüber, while the wardress brings fresh water, fresh sheets, all the unemptied glasses, cups, daily awarding of for repair, nicht wahr? That's how they planned it all. Later then, 10 rooms on each floor, servants galore, with bow and tie, marriage and tea, marriage, and in the evening, a little riot and tea. But when it's time for oranges, as is kindness out, night time at all, for thirst, for Wasser, for being thus arranged. Because oranges are their own maneuvering material. Because trains, bridges, and little grimling glitches keep me going unallayed. Go lack, used to her. Because oranges communicate through the ages. Oranges or restricted residence all around. Oranges or rather limited vision all around. Oranges, or it's like we're in prison, just trees and animals are at the end of the road. When it's time for oranges, as is kind inside, no time at all for world endings or peddler curtains, paper measures for sure. Because they are a center residence for life, for lack, for want, go, be good, but used to her. Go sweep the chimney, why not, so that the doctor comes again, so that the doctor sees how the organs wander through the ages. That's what they figured, not that they wander and then go astray, organs stuck in the body, the organs, block the vocal tracts and the good manner tracts and all the feminine tracts, all range of things. Because storage and organs, because collect yourself and wonder. Glimmering bright and lacking against orderly arrangement, against measures called to wall around my standstill morning. Only at first did I snap off the buttons from the covers and the cases. Then I dropped my cover, coherence, a show, a ticket, loosen it, so to speak, set. Wanted to, the cover, come out from under, come out loose, what they all call paralysis, I call a ticking, in oranges, through the ages. Because I can hear it where I sit in my barracks, in the forest, in my Vienna asylum, in my tent on the Wintermarkt, where I suck it out for hours, what's lacking. Let the tongue run free, looking for grounds between teeth, rejection, Residenzpflicht, waiting rooms, keeps me beschäftigt. Because I not having work, no travel, only thought revel, through thought cuttings. While the wardress takes away the peel, there's sour glimmer all over my life of thirst. Nein, I did not pretend, Hungerstreik, because oranges are asylum and solid geistig nourishment, glimmering. Because one ought to freely choose what one eats, right? Or where one goes, packages laced with marriage, biscuits, and tea, haven't you the faintest, and of that a great deal. But brothers and dogs, they also exist, if you can stomach it, as is the custom. Stutter juice and whoops, open the sluice. When it's time for oranges as a kind inside, no time at all for brothers who are allowed to go off to study, or for dogs on all fours, mind you, slobbering all over my tray, drinking out of my little cup, naughty pup. Oh, long black tongue, why ich das nose, sniffling outside to Huntu. Snap, yes, he drank sloppily from the little cup with the dog tongue. Oh, but that's why they figured, right, that even a dog has more right to run free. But that oranges glimmer, that orange, that one can with an orange and existence derange and switch tracks, so as not to be slurped up by dog tongue, excusez-moi docteur, can he not be taking himself away and take the warding of the water, the cups, and every wall they mounted round my little bed? You see, oranges solidarize. Solidarisieren, those rounds shame organs. I join the wanderings, I squeeze and out comes contrastand, orange in. I am native for something of a girl, solide geistige Nahrung, and she digested with affektive Athletik und Orangenpoetik. Or as you say, ein Organ haben, starting from or with an orange, all droughts are possible, all ways of the voice that lead across it are good. Or as you say, eine Parole haben, you tell me what that means. Dry up in mid-speech, stuck, repeat, ich habe Krämpfe, in my calves, B, my teeth, klappern. I, a native irgendwas girl, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no, yes, namely German, but will try to give as well as a person, between 9 o'clock in the evening till 1 p.m. midnight. Absences, which even with a strange feeling of beobachten können, time missing, but will try to give as well as a person. A windfall when I was circling around the oranges. Island, can, a glimmer, a glimpse. When I was circling around the oranges, who paid them? Who wrote them?
These on? Yes. Okay, so thank you both so much for your readings. I feel like I'm already drawing so many lines between what was read and what was discussed. I want to say something about the relationship between talking cures and the questionnaire, and how you both sort of start from this like institutional space, but it's actually resulted in this sort of failure to communicate in the end. But I don't have any more interesting thoughts than literally saying those things side by side. My brain's not working. But yeah, I think we'll sort of talk amongst ourselves, but I don't want to be too regimented with this whole thing. So if anyone has any questions at any point, please just stick your hand up and ask. Yeah, I think I sort of asked you guys via email to maybe think of something to say with respect to your relationship to translation, not just in the work you read today, but more generally. And so I thought maybe we could start there as a point to sort of generate the discussion.
But I'd like to say something about that very brilliant idea you just performed. Is this working? Oh, thank you. Is this working? About that, so the juxtaposition that you just made between the talking cure and something like a screening procedure. They are in fact similar processes, but at the same time, really weird. Good.
Can everyone hear?
Yeah. Oh, now. Okay. But you heard what I just said. But the screeners, the people who screen children in court, are either civilians, people with, I mean, I don't have any kind of background in psychology, for example. I'm fiction writer primarily. And then there's the lawyers who often don't have any background in psychology either. So it's a very tricky area because you can through a screening process open up very recent wounds that cover very deep trauma, and it's something that as an interpreter you don't have much control over, and you don't. So you have to. It's kind of like you don't want to generate a talking cure space, right? Because that's not it's not the point to cure through getting children to speak. But just get enough information from them in order to say, oh yeah, okay, we have a case here. Let's give it to a pro bono lawyer who might take it up, right? So for example, in interviews in court, I am always very tempted, because I'm Mexican, and I'm full of shame as a Mexican, to hear what happens to them in Mexico, right? Which is the worst. Migrants crossing Mexico really, I mean, if you think about it sort of in Dantesque terms, really are in the final deepest circle of hell when they cross through Mexico. And I often want to hear and say something, but of course I don't, because, or I do just very basic levels, because knowing what happened to them in Mexico is not relevant to their case here. It won't help their asylum here, because it's not something that they suffered here. So it's the same, and it's also quite the opposite of the talking cure, because one does not have the emotional and professional framework or scaffolding to deal with.
And you almost have to sort of prevent that from leaking out.
Exactly. There are people who know how to do that, and children, if they're lucky, do eventually end up working with organizations that know. But there's one organization in New York, I don't know, for those of you who are bilingual, speak Spanish, there is one organization that works with the children that are in the least favorable situation, which is children that arrive here and do not find their parents, so end up living in federal custody facilities, basically like jails, I mean, a little bit better. And these federal custody facilities are kind of hidden. The actual addresses are in like you're not supposed to know where they are. You can't really find them on the internet. And there's one organization, the Young Center, that trains people to become child advocates and primarily trains people to learn how to deal with trauma when you're kind of performing and talking cure through translation and through talking. But other than that, in court, it's not the space.
Yeah. Does this idea of the questionnaire, or does any of that sort of play into the work that you were reading from today?
I mean, yes and no. I think there might be some formal sort of things that to compare a certain relationship, but what I'm thinking, there's a couple of things I'm thinking about, which is the failure of translation in refugee situation, and one of the biggest failures, in a way, Anna herself. I mean, historically, she worked with those girls who had experienced sexual and other violence, and she gave them a home, but she never ever once suggested that they do some kind of therapy. She was scarred by her experience with Goya, and she was against the idea of psychoanalysis or even therapy for the rest of her life. And a lot of her girls could have, some of the girls that she gave a home to, could have used counseling or therapy. But she was sort of scarred by this initial long offset of psychoanalysis or of therapy. So that's sort of a failure right there. And then another thing I'm thinking about, just associating in this sphere, is the failure to contain what you just talked about in the body of the interpreter. I read a fantastic, really strong novel by Shimona. What's her last name? It'll come to me in a second. A French West Bengali writer who worked as a female translator in the asylum system as an interpreter, and wrote a book called, I read the German translation, so it's like Slay the Poor. I don't know what the French is. It's a phrase by Baudelaire originally, and it hasn't been translated. I don't know why. It came out. It's a novel. It fictionalizes a lot, but basically the narrator is a female translator who translates mostly for Indian men who despise her, who would never look her in the eye or talk to her in their own culture in a way. So she's working this very sexist setup and experiences a lot of the violence from the structure that she tried to escape, while at the same time trying to help them, right? And she goes completely bonkers, and she hits a man with the head with a wine bottle in the middle of the subway. So the whole book is written from her jail cell. And she collapses, and when the book came out, she lost her job because the accounts were so horrific. The accounts not only of everything that can go wrong in the asylum system, but also of just the pure honesty with which she said that everyone lies. Everyone lies to have a story that fits. You know, those children that you talked about, they should have, lied to get in. And
want to them to lie.
How can you, as a translator, exactly help them to lie?
These kids are kids, so they can't figure out how to treat the system. And by the way, Homeland Security last week released a memo saying that kids are abusing the system here. It's kind of accusing them of lying their way into, cheating their way into asylum. And so what we should expect, I think in the next months, is amendments to the law that protects these kinds of asylum seekers.
There's so much work to be done right now.
Yeah.
Are there any questions at this point? Yeah, no?
This isn't exactly a question. It's not exactly a question, it's more another side-by-side thing I noticed between Sophie, your introduction, and what you were saying about Anna O. Because Freud and Breuer, when they were talking about hysteria, they also called it conversion disorder, which is essentially where something in the mind is repressed, and then it gets translated or converted into a symptom in the body. And so hysteria itself is an act of translation. And early in Freud's career, he believed that the goal was to make the unconscious conscious. But then later he shifted from the idea that there was this original in the unconscious, sort of like you were talking about, being true to the translation, or the original, but actually to try to understand the process of translation. And that's really where the work is. And it reminds me of what you were talking about. It's sort of a way of resituating, looking at translations. So it's not a way of, accessing the original in another language, but it's something, it's a process in itself. So it's new.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for pointing that out as a conversion disorder, conversation and conversion disorder. And I feel like a lot of the pieces that you selected are exactly like you say, they are between, actually occupying the space between languages, right? Sort of mapping these conversions and also mapping where the translation has not been finished, where the languages just sort of coexist, like in Anna's text or the brain or in that sort of translation act.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the whole thing with raising awareness of the translator, yeah, just completely altering the perception of the idea of the original text and the translation and the process that comes between that, and sort of moving away from the idea that there's an essential piece of information that you're trying to access, and that it's more about the process in between those 2 points.
Can I say something about that? I mean, I think I think you also, you were speaking more in terms of psychology, but I think in terms of translation, and going back to what Anna was originally saying about translation, and what you were saying as well, as being interested in the process and not the final product. I also very much, I think, agree with you with this notion of the translator's invisibility, and how translators get told that their work is good when it doesn't seem like a translation, which is kind of absurd, right?
Yeah. It's fluent, or it's elegant, or
it doesn't sound translated.
If it doesn't advertise itself as a translation, then it's a good thing, so it gets reviewed.
Exactly, it gets really well, it gets domesticized, or how is often the term often used in translation studies. And something that sort of going back from this to your first question about our own interests in translation, I had the fortune of having a very good translator into English for my first books, which were written in Spanish.
This is Christina
McSween. Yeah, she's just, I don't know her, but she's an absolute genius.
Is she a writer or she's a translation?
She's a translator.
Yeah.
She's never revealed.
Just translation.
Yeah. And that's what she would say. Yeah. No, I mean just as an only and not both.
Would she though? Because I think I read something where it said that you sort of work, you were talking earlier about working on top of an English translation.
Yeah.
Is it the case that she translates and then you sort of strenuously edit?
Well, I was going to go there. Yeah, exactly. So
sorry,
I'm not
dropping the gun.
It's okay. So she translates. She translated all my books in Spanish, from 3 up until now, and I give her a lot of freedom because she's so inventive to not be literal and to not be so loyal to the original, to kind of like, I don't know, do whatever she wants with it. And then she gives me a lot of freedom to come into the text and use it as a kind of first draft of a manuscript that I then rewrite and edit and rewrite and edit, and often ping pong with her, and she kind of edits, and it's a very collaborative process. So much so that the last book that she translated of mine, The Story of My Teeth, she came up with this. It's a book with a lot of names of people. And I won't explain why right now, but she's very meticulous. So in order for herself understand why there were so many names and what the relationships were, she made a kind of map of those names and wrote kind of bios to understand who they were, who these people were, and how they connected to each other. A completely kind of schizophrenic map, but fantastic, like a really thorough, investigative process. And she showed it to me one day, and I mean, I thought it was such brilliant work that I asked my editors in English whether they could incorporate that as a chapter of the book. playing against the idea that she should be invisible as a translator. So it's a chapter called Chronologics by Christine McSweeney, and it's one of the best chapters of the book, I think, because it's like really short pieces connected to each other, and it reads beautifully. And so I don't know. I very much think that translators should push to become more visible.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's easy because collaboration is easy between two people that understand each other well.
Yeah.
But I don't know. There should be more
And I
collaboration.
think you can sometimes see more space for that in poetry, but it's interesting hearing you talk about how that might function in the context of fiction, and that it is possible.
It is completely possible.
Yeah. Did you want to say a bit more about? I'm interested because we were sort of initially occupying this weird in-between space when we were talking about kind of legal translation and interpreting, and then on the other hand, I was talking about poetry translation, and it felt sort of unnatural to switch between the two. But I'm interested in hearing a bit more about your relationship with translation in a literary context.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first, our process is very similar to the one you described. I love the fact that you described it in fiction, which is really the first time I think I've heard about such a more poetic collaboration of writing and rewriting. Working with Sophie Seiter is really very wonderfully a creative process, because the interesting thing about Sophie Seiter is that she is also a German native speaker, but an English poet. So she's between languages in a way that I am too. I don't write in English, but she's in between languages more than a translator would be. And so she's also more interested in messing with languages and messing up the space between them, which really works with my work, right? And so she gives me a draft, and she takes a lot of liberties, and then I love her ideas and then I run with it, or I go and sort of have my own ideas in English and sort of rewrite. It's a similar space. I've translated almost as long as I've written poetry, and really from I remember one of the first things that I did when I was a poet was also go to a translation workshop of German-Polish poetry, knowing no Polish, and the idea that you can meet with the poet and then have a language facilitator and then work a sort of workshop situation to do what we call Nachdichten, which is a more poetic word for translation. It means to write poetry after this person, like after work or after some, or in the way of this person. So this is something that has a long tradition in Germany.
So that's the official term, like after
Nachdichten.
writing.
Yeah, after
Yeah,
writing.
it's all
Exactly.
compound.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful German compound term. Nachdichten. And it's time, and it's after as in the manner and after as in time, right? So it's both of these things. And so that was an amazing project, and it liberated me to the idea of translation, but also translating and poetry sort of folding into each other, because I think my first translations were very free, and very inspiring in a general sense, because then I went to Poland, I studied in Poland and learned actually Polish for a while, and my first book was about German-Polish relationship, very troubled relationship, obviously, and borders and shifting borders and languages. So since then, really, translation has always been part of my work. Yeah. Not just as a translator, but folded back into the writing. And yeah.
Were those initial translations, would you call them versions?
Yes.
Use that term.
Yeah.
What do you think of that term? I've got a sort of fraught relationship with it, where I can see the sort of utility of it, but also it accounts for a lot of work in translation in the UK that I find, just horrendously dull and derivative. Something like John Patterson's Rilke.
By poet
versions.
translators. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think the version is unfortunately, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's more of a male gesture to
Yes.
translate the versions.
Yeah, absolutely.
In between your books, and use another book, which I read.
Yeah. And you get to attach your name to like something
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's No, I think that's interesting.
And just to add a little footnote to that, the emblematic essay on translation by the emblematic Mexican phallus. Like Uljana Wolf, a great poet, but a great big phallus as well. No, not that I ever had experience of myself. His essay is called Versions and Diversions. So yeah, it is precisely that kind of riff on the same idea. Uljana Wolf.
No, I didn't hear that part for some reason.
No, I really put too much attention on
Yes, all of that.
Yeah. But I mean, if you think of versions as, if you think of what are so-called originals as versions, then I think that you can play around more with that. I certainly think of every stage of my writing as a version, and any book that I end up publishing has gone through so many versions. I don't only mean in like first draft, second draft, kind of thing, but they are often published versions really of something. And like for example, the story of my teeth that I was talking about originally was a fictional account inside an art catalog of the putting together of an exhibition in the Jumex factory, the Jumex gallery, which is next to the Jumex factory in Mexico. So I had sent a bunch of installments, weekly installments to workers in the juice factory, and I asked them, 12 of them were involved in this process. They would read those first installments out loud, record themselves reading out loud, and then criticize them and suggest things. And then I would write the next installment, and then change the versions.
So that was collective post-editing sort of process, or did it alter it to an extent?
It altered completely, and the book was written in that mode. Then there was the catalog piece. Then there was a version in Spanish that I put together pieces of that with a book. At the same time, Christina McSweeney had been simultaneously translating pieces in English, because she had also published the English version of the original, of the installment pieces in the catalog. And then I rewrote her manuscript, and then a fact checker came in and fact checked the whole novel, but like deeply, like 40-page Excel of fact checking questions. For example, there was the narrator says at some point that he thinks that Dostoevsky's father was probably a degenerate, and the fact checker checked, was Dostoevsky's father a degenerate? And then she actually came up with the answer, yes.
But this sounds like another chapter. Like
it became a chapbook. But it's also like a version of the novel, because it tells the whole novel all over again through its facts. And I've been pushing for it to become a chapter, but maybe it's okay. It's just something that circulates. But then there's translations of the book, like the translation into Chinese, where it's still not over and not done yet, but it's in the process of being done. And there, my editors said that they want to publish yes or yes, the fact check, as part of the book. So maybe that will be the first version.
Where yes.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, it's all of it versions, right? It's not like riffs on something, but it's just stages of development process, as you were saying. The process of translation very visibly, messily displayed.
Yeah.
My German translator, my German publisher, very angry one day in an email said, she's fantastic, Anti Kunstmann.
Oh, yeah.
And I respect her and I fear her enormously. And I sent her a book and I said, I remember making a little changes, Auntie, I'm sorry. And then she wrote me very angry, saying, what, Valeria? What am I supposed to tell the press when that I publish work in progress? And this word by saying, yes.
Is your new collaboration with Sophie, does it have as many moving parts.
You know, no, it's actually it's selective basically that Sophie's doing of my last couple of books, putting together for Belladonna Press, it's here, which is scheduled to come out in actually probably early release in May, whatever. We're still working on it. And the title is Subsisters. And Subsisters is the title of one of a section in my second book where I delved into the world of subtitling and translation in film, and thought a lot about subtitling and what happens when you watch an original film in one language and you read another language at the bottom of it, and what does that cognitively to your understanding of language and collapse of translation possibly. And I was also obsessed with 1940s, 1950s film noirs at that point, with all the feminine, the heroines, and I watched a lot of Douglas Sirk, who's originally Austrian, and so then I did sort of an installation as poetry, and I took one woman and a film, and I wrote a box-shaped poem, which I called Original Version Wolfau. And then on the other side, I did another box, original version, the subtitle. And I tried to use the same word material in both versions, but slightly derange it in the second version, as if you're listening, but you can kind of missing something. So then it's like symbols, and just opened up what happens in this process, what kind of poetry happens in this process, and what happened. And I didn't know this before, is that the something happened on a gender level. So the women of the films, who are sisters, right? Subtitled subsisters. They were also like my sister, the Meredith sisters. When they behave more according to the moral standards and codes of the film of the 50s in the one box, and then in the deranged language box, they were also liberated, and they became strange and wild and violent, and all kinds of things happened. So that was a really fun project. And what Sophie did, of course, how do you translate that? So I told her, try to translate the process, okay? Write one poem, or sort of loosely base it on my poems, and then to do the same thing with deranging the language material, which she then did very closely. She managed to be close to what I did and also do her own things. And then she added an English version, her own poem, basically.
So now, at that point, she's seen the second part of your process on the first.
Yeah, now she does three. So she does original version with subtitles, and then she does one that she calls English version, which is funny because the other ones are also English. But that's sort of her version. Like, she wrote her own poem based on my poems, and they're all English, but they all inhabit different realms of breakdown of translation. And I'm trying to figure out right now how to visually represent it with the layout, because in the German book, it's nice, you have 2 pages, so the translation process is, so you kind of need a third that you can take out, or maybe a transparent sheet or something, where we can still work on that. So that's an example where really the translation spills over and creates new poetry, and where the method of the constraint is sort of more important.
It's like a mutant bacteria strain, just continually reproducing it on itself. Any questions from anyone else at this point, or just like observations or translations? Yeah. Oh, here we go.
Cecilia Pacchino was talking last week about the difficulty of being able to tell lies from truth in this current political climate. And I was thinking about the difficulty of getting away from English as it's being used and abused. And I was thinking about children and blockage and trauma and these various questions that are coming up in both of your work. And I wondered if you just had any further comments on that.
Can I answer it? You like push the button. especially with what you said in regards to English and how to use it. That's what you said, right? Okay. Not what I I'm gonna use and abuse your whatever you said. Because I mean this is pretty obvious in a way, but because English is the dominant language of the internet, not only the dominant language of transactions in general, kind of lingua franca, even though not spoken by everyone on the planet, of course, but the language was spoken as a second language. There are a lot of concepts I find being foreign, being Mexican. I don't know what is your experience, but that have now become a common currency in Spanish, but are imported, translated without being rendered into another language, not rendered into Spanish, but translated as carried over into Spanish context and applied, and then often misapplied, because they are concepts that very much were just stated here. I think of concepts such as minority, or white privilege, or I don't know, all the language that circulate right now, even mansplaining, that's a great one. That's applicable everywhere. But I find that language is often being greatly misused, misapplied outside the context in which it's created. Not that we don't have a right to appropriate and re-signify and use, but I think it's a very tricky area because often people that don't necessarily find the term minority, for example, the most comprehensive way to define their identity, begin to see themselves through the filter of a concept created probably within the spheres of privilege, of academic or research institutions, and so even though in the US creating that kind of language has allowed a conversation to begin and a lot of things to be called out and denounced, it also means that there's kind of no escape from that here in the US. I mean, you're a minority, that's what you are, and that's it. And there's no escape from that. But that's also kind of now permeated the discourse in other language, in other contexts as well. So it's a whole realm of like dominion, being sort of dominated through translation, through carrying over concepts and terms. I don't know how you see it in German. I mean, maybe I see this more as a Mexican word, we're more near. And
I think the global sort of colonial, post-colonial setup, I think is very different when it comes to Europe and European languages. I think we have a very different structure, especially maybe the German language is a very strong language and gets translated into a lot. It's sort of a bigger language when compared to Czech or Slovakian or Hungarian, and then there's other sort of power structures.
Spanish, however. Right?
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, you're right. I'm thinking of the concept of a minor language often that I find really productive, which Deleuze and Guattari developed when reading Kafka. So a minor language as one that is in opposition or struggle with the majority language, and I often ask myself how to achieve writing in a minor language, especially with using English, because that's the language that I use to make my German funky, messy, but it's still English, right? It's still the majority language, so how does that work? Am I just continue to represent translation as a form of continuous power and measurement, whatever? But then they define writing in a minor language also as becoming a nomad in your own language, and with the presence of other languages or not, and that's just sort of a way that I try to write and use translation as a tool to become a nomad in my own language in a way. But I wanted to say something else in response to the language use in a way. I teach a translation class at Pratt Institute, and we just had a session today, and we talked about film and translation, and we read an essay by a queer film critic, Ruby Rich, where she talked about the why it is and what cultural implication it has that people don't like to watch foreign language films or subtitled films. I mean, not here, not this audience maybe, but in general maybe the American audience. And she raises the idea that maybe, a nation or maybe the people would be less hostile to other nations if they just heard other voices, more other voices, and they just went to foreign language film to hear other voices. While this is a very simplistic sort of, approach, when I read the word voice, it just was so painful after yesterday's, orange attack on Congress. I mean, the speech that Trump gave, in which he said that he was that he asked Homeland Security to create voice victims of immigrant crimes engagement. Yeah, voice, called voice. And I just could not believe that this current language is not only abusing English, but then taking the concept of voice also. Like, you have the voice already. It's so painful and just wants to scream. But on a sort of meta level, it feels so sickening when you just feel about voices that need to be represented. And so the work really needs to continue.
Okay, well I think I'm going to sort of ask you guys a final question, and then I think we're more or less up to time. And this is, I'm sorry, it's feels like asking you the answer to life, the universe, and everything. But I'm wondering what you think literary translation's political power is and can be, and what literary translation should aim to achieve now. Whether it can constitute a form of activism that actually affects things. I know for myself, my own translation work, a part of that is contradicting the gender bias in translation. So we know that men and women do translate work in equal numbers, but the huge majority of texts that are translated into English are from male-authored texts. So within my own work, it's sort of a refusal to translate men, and from the Dutch, which is what I'm working from, sort of recovering this lost history of Dutch female modernists, often Jewish female modernists, that have been kind of paved over in European literary history. Any sort of thoughts in that vein on your own work?
Yeah, I think this the task can be so manifold, and I think we touched upon so many already, like being in the field, so to speak, and give voice to children, or exactly like choosing who you translate and working on visibility, or using translation as a tool to, as I see it as enrichment, but also as creating a certain poverty. Right? It's also a concept which I took from the minor language essay, to make your language poorer by making it a nomad, or by making it a sort of a corrupt or destabilized and all these things. So I think on the one hand, I want translation to be a political tool to do all the good things like enrichment and widen your own language, widen your culture, blah, 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 blah. At the same time, all of this, which is a work of stabilization, should also be undermined in my translation. And I think poetry, in a way, can do both. I hope so, but it's sort of this little bit of schizophrenic.
It really puts me in mind of the Domi Choi statement that I read at the beginning, sort of underlining the inequity between the languages that she's translating between, as much as, sort of translation being this kind of humanist gesture.
I think it's our. We're no heroes, right? But we're just writers and translators, and it's more than activism. I think it's just our duty to call out those things and to just work hard. I mean, I think really our only duty is to write as best as we can, to not add more shit. If we, in that process, can create something that has political impact, we'll be very lucky. I don't think that any writer can or should aspire to create something that will make political change. Maybe a translator's task is different. I'm speaking right now as a fiction writer. Because that puts you in a situation of intellectual vanity and arrogance that is bound to result in the shittiest novel possible, right? And a novel that's more a pamphlet, that's moralizing, that wants to teach you a lesson, and no. So that's how I see the first part of what you're saying. On the other hand, I think that with this very sophisticated and smart focus that you put on translation as a process that we can almost visibly see on page, perhaps in the book, you are also giving emphasis to the fact that translation is ultimately an act of communication between two people, right? The writer, the translator, it's a back and forth. And that is an example of something almost miraculous, to people actually understanding each other, to people working through the misunderstandings and working them over and creating something that is a conversation, because the result is a conversation. And if in that process something that destabilizes the so-called target text, in this case translating from some language into English, meaning if English can become foreignized, made strange, and is completely unrelatable at first sight, fantastic. Then you've done something, I think, innovative. I often really want to kick my students out of class. I don't, because I guess in this America I would be fired. Because students, I guess, where there's a client relationship, right? You have to keep them really well. But I go crazy every time they say that they like a text because it's so relatable. I cannot go crazy. Literature should not be liked because it speaks about you, because you can see yourself in the mirror of the text. It's the most idiotic way of understanding literature. If literature creates empathy with something that's completely other, that's completely foreign, then it's good literature, I think. So I think my only kind of activist intent is as a teacher, more than as a writer, trying to teach texts that are completely unrelatable, and then hopefully getting students to engage with them.
That was a really good thought to end on. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Valeria and